strategic and consciously managed. So it's something that it's work that we do as teachers to communicate the sense of professional identity that we carry with us into the classroom. Of course, sometimes someone who's been teaching a long time may carry some of those aspects of teacher identity out of the classroom. I can think of someone who's been a primary school teacher for many, many years. And when I see her interacting with people in social situations, she still seems to be carrying some of that attribute of being a teacher, the way she talks, with the kind of way she speaks, the speed with which she talks. Sometimes I've got the feeling that she's carrying her teacher identity too far into normal social relations. And of course, the other thing happens when somebody carries their personal identity into the classroom and is not taken seriously as a teacher because he or she is too casual, too informal, too much trying to be a friend, and that is not the identity that we need to achieve if we're going to communicate the sense of professional identity. Now, of course, our proficiency in the language that we're teaching, in this case, you're likely to be concerned with English, our ability and knowledge of the English language is an important aspect of our professional identity. And if our students get a sense that we're not confident in our control of English, that we don't know a lot about the subject matter, they will soon recognize a gap in your professional identity. And a couple of quotes there from a Danish teacher who is trying to teach her academic subjects in English, and she comments that I think the main problem in my teaching is I don't have a natural ability to handle the language, so I often have to stop, interrupt myself, and so on. Or a Chinese student teacher who says, I think my English proficiency is not good enough, I really want to do my best, and so on. So in situations like these, to maintain a sense of professional identity, teacher professional identity, the teacher may try to avoid situations where his or her proficiency in English is likely to be revealed. For example, avoiding unprepared situations, open-ended questions, and so on. Improvisation as a teaching skill, and avoiding situations like these where he or she will not come across as very confident because of the limitations that the teacher feels in terms of their English. So it's something that we have to work to maintain. The next feature that I want to look at is to do with teacher beliefs and principles. I was prompted to think about this notion of teachers' beliefs and principles some years ago when I was field testing some textbook materials that I had written for Oxford University Press. And we took a couple of sample units from the textbook to institutes in Japan, Tokyo, and asked teachers to teach them. So we had about 6 different teachers teaching exactly the same material to exactly the same kind of students. But when I observed those lessons and talked to the teachers about them, first of all, I observed that there were 6 different lessons. They weren't all teaching the same way. They were teaching the same material to the same students. They had the similar levels of professional experience, and they were all native speakers of English. And yet they came up with 6 different ways of teaching the lesson. And as I interviewed them, it became clear to me that they taught differently because they believed they had different principles, or what we call personal constructs of teaching. They had different understandings of what teaching is and how they, as a teacher, should seek to realize the way they understand their teacher's self. So these are what are sometimes called personal constructs of teaching, which Schulman talked about here in a classic paper some years ago. The final source of the knowledge of teaching is the wisdom of practice itself, the maxims that guide or provide reflective rationalization for the practice of teachers. Interestingly, I picked up that notion of maxims in a paper, a research paper that I did at the time, looking through a lot of data that I had on interviews with teachers from classroom observations. And I wrote a paper on teachers' maxims or principles, which I thought was quite original and useful at the time. And it was published in Test Quarterly. And then at the same time, my colleague and friend, Kathleen Bailey in San Francisco, came up with an almost identical concept in the paper that she had written. And it was called The Best Laid Plans. And it was looking at how teachers modify their lessons as they proceed based on whether they feel the lesson is realizing their principles or maxims or values, if you like. So personal constructs of teaching. Now, these beliefs may be quite general. For example, that all lessons should connect to students' lives, or they might be quite specific. For example, that peer error correction is more effective than teacher correction. Or they may be specific to a particular group of learners. For example, in the case of a class containing students of very fixed levels, in which case the teacher might apply principles such as these to vary group structures, to provide more support and guidance to students who need it, and to set individualized learning goals for each student. One of the teachers I interviewed for a study in Hong Kong described her philosophy of teaching in this way, which you can read there, very personal philosophy, which has led to certain principles that she tries to realize in her lessons. I always try to create lessons which enhance communication and cooperation. I step back and more student-centered. So then she uses those principles as the basis for evaluating her success in a lesson. Now, different beliefs, of course, are sometimes associated with particular methods or teaching approaches. And so a teacher who is trained in a so-called communicative approach will likely have beliefs such as those of the list there, that language is necessary for communication, that making mistakes is part of learning, and students learn more if they're active and engaged, which leads to classroom practices of the kind you see there. So here, the teacher's beliefs are quite specific and result in very particular classroom practices. Whereas a teacher who has a more traditional kind of grammar-based understanding of language, form-focused approach, might believe that accurate grammar and vocabulary are the foundations of language. Students need clear structure, and learning is more efficient when guided step by step. And then you will get classroom practices more like the ones that you see there. The point that I would make here is that you cannot really understand a teacher's teaching unless you first talk to the teacher to find out what his or her beliefs are. So I certainly don't believe in unannounced visits to teachers' classrooms to, if you like, evaluate or get information on how well the teacher is teaching. You first need to find out what are the teacher's core principles or values, and how are these principles going to be realized in the lesson that you observe, because you cannot make sense of the way teacher teaches unless you know what his belief systems are. So teachers' beliefs then. The next issue I want to look at has to do with teacher motivation. And I'll look at 4 dimensions of motivation: commitment, self-esteem, agency, and self-efficacy. Let us start with the notion of commitment, which refers to the extent to which a teacher is personally engaged with teaching. You know, it's not just a job, it's a profession, which involves commitment. The extent to which the teacher has a sense of vocation, identifies with and supports the school's goals and preferences, and is willing to invest personal resources of time and energy in order to achieve excellence in teaching. I could say here also, of course, that teachers' sense of commitment is likely to be more intense if they're paid a decent salary. And not simply regarded as a dispensable or disposable workforce, that they have proper working conditions and contracts and so on. So you can't expect someone to be highly committed to teaching if they're not treated well and given the resources that they need to be able to teach well. This next quote is from a teacher who describes her sense of commitment. You see there what she says: I'm a teacher, but I'm not simply a teacher. I am an English, social studies, and math teacher, teacher of teachers, and student of teachers, and so on. Believes in and is committed to a just society, and so on. Very nice way she describes. This was a Chinese woman in San Francisco on her PhD dissertation, where she made this quotation, which I found quite powerful. Another comment from a study that I did with a colleague in Sydney, and one of the teachers we interviewed was an Australian Brazilian English teacher. She's teaching in a EAP program in Australia, and she commented that she kind of likes to sort of drop into conversations in the staff room that she's doing a PhD. In other words, she's trying to let the other teachers know that she's more serious, she's more committed, because that's why she's engaged in PhD. And she consciously drops that reference into the conversations with her colleagues. To distinguish, she says here, even though this isn't going to make anyone like me, I guess it marks my status as a teacher, someone who wants to improve themselves. So the notion of commitment is something that comes up when you interview teachers who are really achieving great results. What does it makes you seek to get really high standards out of your students? And often it's a sense of commitment to being a teacher. The notion of self-esteem is also an important attribute to what they call the teacher's self. That is how you value yourself, the extent to which you believe yourself to be competent and of value to others, self-esteem. This quotation there was from an Iranian teacher that I interviewed, and his fantastic teacher. In fact, I gave him a scholarship to his master's degree in the UK, which he did with great distinction. He said, whenever I have a conversation with someone, the peak of my pride and honor is when I introduce myself as a teacher. So self-esteem, he has a very positive view of himself as a teacher. I try to, what it says, to be a positive representation of my profession. Self-esteem. Agency refers to the extent to which teachers are able to actively contribute to and manage change in their own teaching. In some institutions, teachers are not credited with much agency. They're simply implementing decisions made by others. Here's the syllabus, here's the curriculum, here's the materials. You must follow these step by step. So, in other words, teachers' agency is not supported or rewarded in some contexts as opposed to others. And here is again, this is actually a teacher from Thailand. One of my former students. He says, I like to try out new things in my teaching. To do so, I take charge of my own learning and try to learn a new language using my own tips and techniques. A very good way to experience what my learners go through. By using this strategy, I get a lot of ideas of what works best for me. So he's taking control, taking charge of his own professional development in a way, and that's what we mean by agency, characteristic of the teacher's self. So the last aspect of the teacher's self that I want to touch on here is the notion of self-efficacy. The extent to which the teacher regards herself as being effective, the ability to perform well, to achieve their goals, to maintain their commitment, in spite of difficulties they may encounter, and she provides support to students' learning. So some teachers may have low sense of self-efficacy. They don't feel they can make much of a difference. The situation is too difficult. the students are not interested, my resources are not very good, and they sort of just adopt a sort of mechanistic procedural approach to teaching, getting through lessons as best they can, as opposed to somebody who realizes that they have the ability to perform well and sets goals and targets for themselves, and this enables them to overcome some of the frustrations and difficulties that they may encounter. So here again is the teacher Ahmad that I interviewed in Iran. I believe to be effective, I could explain to you the idea that their success will prepare them well for the future. So putting the students to the right path. So those four issues that we looked at there, agency, belief, self-efficacy, and so on. These are some of the key points of the attributes of the teacher self that shape the way teachers become engaged in their lessons. I now want to turn to the learners, and again to look at what we might call the learner self, which refers to how students see themselves, including their beliefs, identities, goals, motivations, and so on. And it also includes how learners view the nature of language learning and their response to the experience of being a learner, how they understand their role in classroom learning, and how they manage their learning. So these features shape students' engagement in classes, their performance, their confidence, their participation in learning, and can influence their commitment to learning and, of course, their ultimate goals and achievement. The learner self also includes the dispositions learners have towards classroom learning, the kind of participation they behave. So, for example, are they a relaxed or anxious type of learner? Some may find the language class an opportunity to relax and enjoy themselves. For others, it may arouse anxiety and they may be reluctant to participate. We can also look at the extent to which learners engage in risk-taking or risk-avoiding. Some are not afraid to try new things, even if they may not be very successful. Others avoid activities that involve risks. You may find students sit at the back of the class right at the front of the class because they're less likely to fall upon, to answer questions, to take part in the classroom discussions or whatever. So students with a tendency to avoid risks and tend to move themselves out of the teacher's action zone. We think of the action zone as the space, the physical space that the teacher makes use of to engage with students in the classroom, with teachers in the front of the class. That may be a limited scope of interaction with students in the class, as opposed to a teacher who moves around, sometimes teaching from the back of the class, sometimes teaching front of the class, and so on. Some students are playful or serious. They enjoy activities that have a playful and fun element, but others may not. Others may think that learning is a serious business and may dislike such activities. So a student may say, I came to learn, not to play games. Some students have a sort of fuzzy focus or black and white focus. Some don't need clear activities. They others prefer an unambiguous kind of focus for activity. So some students are happy with activities that seem rather vague. Others want to see a very clear outcome, very clear procedures that they have to focus. They're not willing to take a risk and enter activity unless they see very clear focus. Why am I doing it? What is the point of that? Now, lastly, confidence or insecure. Some students may have confidence in their abilities, while some may be less sure of their abilities. So these are dispositions towards classroom learning that are also part of what you mean the learner's self, the personal attributes that they have or dispositions they have towards classroom instruction. I now want to look at learner self in relation to the three factors that we discussed in relation to teacher self, that is learner identity, learner beliefs, and learner motivation. So learner identity involves the beliefs, values, and commitments an individual holds towards being a language learner, as distinct from another type of learner, maybe a learner of geography or a learner of science, as well as how the learner views their status as a language learner and is viewed by other people. And this, of course, can influence the learner's attitude and motivation towards English, influencing such things as whether they wish to maintain or hide their status as a language learner. So I speak Indonesian reasonably well and French much better. But when I'm in situations when I'm in the context of native speakers of French, I have to make a decision. I want to avoid interaction, to avoid showing the fact that I'm a second language learner of French and not at a very advanced level, or shall I look for situations where I'm not going to have to reveal that aspect of myself as a learner of French. It also influences the kind of target the learner may set for themselves. Are they happy to have a variety of English that reflects they are a learner, or that they have a mother tongue which is dominant, so they don't mind reflecting their cultural identity through their accent? In other words, they're quite happy to have a marked Chinese, French, German, or whatever accent when they speak English, as opposed to somebody who feels that the target has to be that of a native speaker of American English or British English or whatever. I think these days, of course, with the notion of English as an international language, much more emphasis on using English as a resource, but not trying to eradicate or hide the fact that it also carries with it marker of your cultural identity, which is an important part of your personal identity. So no need to try to mimic the, to try to pretend that you're a native speaker when that's not really your goal. The goal is to learn English as a resource, as a tool, if you like, without trying to disappear and hide your identity as a speaker of another language. So, of course, learners bring particular identities to the classroom. So, when you have a group of adult learners, they might come in, they might be a mother or an engineer or a teenager or a business person, whatever. But in the language class, their identities are kind of negated, and they are regarded as sort of beginner, intermediate, or advanced. In other words, they're perceived according to proficiency in English, not in terms of the personal identities and values that they actually come into the classroom with. Norton and McKinney talked a lot about this. When language learners speak, they not only exchange information, they're constantly organizing, reorganizing a sense of who they are. So an investment in the target language, i.e. committed to learning, which is also an investment in the learner's own identity. So you might say that we need to drop the term second language learner because and use the term a bilingual or multilingual speaker of a language. The notion of a second language learner suggests that there's a never-ending path towards some idealized, unattainable goal to sound like a native speaker. That concept is not useful, but more useful the notion of somebody with multilingual language resources, which many native speakers do not get because they're monolingual. So that to see bilingualism or multiculturalism as an asset, and there's a very nice PhD thesis I read recently about Indonesian students studying in a program in LA, in Los Angeles, doing masters in TESOL, and how initially they felt somewhat restrained by the fact that their native speaker classmates spoke native speaking American English, but over time they began to mark more often the fact that they were all bilingual or multilingual, which their classmates were not. So they tried to see multilingualism as an asset to remind their classmates that, in the sense, their classmates were handicapped because they're all monolingual and monocultural, whereas they came in most of them multilingual, speaking at least 3 languages. So a different way of perceiving oneself as a bilingual or multilingual speaker of English rather than someone who is on a never-ending path towards native speaker proficiency in the language. There's a nice study by Lam, I think, who looked at the identity transformation of a Chinese immigrant teenager in San Francisco, who in class was positioned as a low-achieving ESL learner, in other words, based on his proficiency in English. And this handicapped his participation in cultural activities. However, in an online context where he belonged to an online group, his identity was quite different. He actively participated in English language interaction with a transnational peer group on the internet. So his identity became much more confident in online communication, where he had a sense of belonging to a global international community of users of English. So that was the notion of the identity being shaped by interaction and context, and how the learner reinvented, if you like, his identity, not being a sort of handicapped second language speaker of English, being a confident user of an international language. So for some learners, the classroom might be seen as a site of struggle. And silence is one way of protecting your identity. So the learner may be highly motivated, but yet not prepared to invest themselves in classroom practice because they don't feel that they provide opportunities for them to excel. There may be aspects of the classroom which might be sexist, elitist, racist, homophobic, or whatever. They may be misread as poor or unmotivated. And so, despite being highly motivated in time, they could be positioned as a poor or unmotivated language learner. And so, this often leads to, if you like, silence, the unwillingness to communicate, which has been particularly researched in relation to Chinese learners of English or Japanese learners of English who don't want to be seen to be showing off class, so they don't communicate, even though they could if they wish to. Learner beliefs, the preconceived ideas. So students come to class, of course, with they've learned maybe other languages, or they have learned other subjects, and their cultural background, educational experience, and observation with other learners, and particularly within their own family, might lead to particular sets of beliefs that they come to about what constitutes good teaching and what constitutes good learning strategies. So they may have particular views about the importance of grammar, for example, the value of translation, the value or limitations of certain kinds of classroom activities, such as group work. And often you may come across what you could call curriculum misalignment, where the teachers and learners have different beliefs about different aspects of language learning. Student believes translation is the best way to learn your grammar or improve your English, while the teacher may feel that communicative methodologies discourage the use of the mother tongue in the classroom. Curriculum misalignment. So some examples here of what learners expect for teachers. These are from Australian students who are asked what they understood a good teacher to be. Someone who can persuade other people, quite articulate here in what they said about what they expect from the teachers that they encounter. This is secondary school students. The ultimate thing is the ability to learn to sit down and talk to students, and so on. Even students may have particular beliefs, particularly young students who think of primary school students, where reading is a very important part of the curriculum when children start in primary school. One of the goals of primary school education is to establish literacy. And yet the ability to read may be understood by children in quite different ways. For some, for example, they may feel that reading is saying words correctly, reading aloud, in other words. Reading, in other words, is a performance. So they see that reading is a performance, so the ability to demonstrate to your classmates that you know how those words are pronounced. Another child may simply believe that reading is simply something you do at school. You wouldn't normally do it except it's part of schoolwork. It's not something you would do at home. Not something you would normally choose to do on your own. For some children, reading might be a source of status. They like to be able to read aloud, to demonstrate to their classmates that they know how to read aloud, for example. Something it's a performance, something to be demonstrated in front of colleagues, the classmates. Some may see reading as a way of learning information. They want to read things that contain interesting and important information. For others, reading may be something private, something they do at home. They have colorful little books at home that they read and enjoy, that their mothers read stories to them and so on, or that they like to read when they're on their own at home, something that you do in private. And lastly, some students may believe that reading is a shared activity with some that's fun if you do it with others. So quite different understandings about the nature of a particular classroom activity, such as reading. This is from looking at primary school children at probably the first or second grade, third grade probably. We also, of course, bring to our classroom beliefs that reflect our cultural background. We have a couple of interesting quotes. First of all, Australian students studying in China, commenting on the fact that they say that the Chinese teachers don't know how to teach, they never had any real teacher training, all they do is follow the book. And then Chinese students studying in Australia, saying that Australian teachers are friendly, but they can't teach well, and never know where they're going, there's no system, and just get lost. So you have two different philosophies of teaching there. Again, this is an issue of misalignment, where the teacher's understanding of teaching is very different from that of the learners. And in both cases, they're reflecting the pedagogical culture, the educational culture, the culture of learning that you would expect to see in the classroom in Australia, which might be very different if you observe a classroom of secondary school students in China or Thailand. So the school children come, or learners, or young people come to language classes bringing with them certain values that reflect their cultural background. This may also reflect the view of the teacher, that the student sees teachers as persons with authority, which may differ from the way the teacher is understood in Western culture. Different set of assumptions about the nature of classroom communication, what kind of communication and interaction is a normal feature of classroom communication. Differences between the learners and the teacher's view of the good learner. Quite a lot of people who have taught in countries like the United States, including myself, where you have different students from very different cultures, some from Middle Eastern culture, some from European culture, some from Asian cultural background. And certainly you get very different kind of dynamics from different cultures. And some students from some cultures may feel it's normal question teacher, challenge the teacher, or to express disagreement with the teacher. Others may feel that in their culture, teacher is a person to be respected, and you wouldn't disagree with the teacher publicly, to try to and so on. So differences between the learners and the teacher's views of a good teacher. The learner may resist some classroom activities which they don't feel represent their cultural based assumptions about classroom communication. where they have been learned to value humility and avoid demonstrating how well they can speak English in front of their classmates, which their peers may interpret as showing off. So this, I think I referred to earlier, that there's a phenomenon known as willingness to communicate in studies of Chinese classroom learning, and also in studies of Japanese students, that they don't like to show off, to demonstrate their ability to use English because they don't want to be kind of positioning themselves ahead of their classmates. And so, although they actually are quite capable of using good English in class, they avoid speaking. There's sort of a willingness to communicate issue. Motivation, of course, is often described as the driving force of second language learning, and students with strong desire to learn a new language, without a strong desire to learn a new language, are unlikely to invest the amount of time and effort involved. So that's kind of common sense, isn't it? Unless you have a good reason to do so, you will not be willing to invest a lot of time in it. No matter what it is, if you're trying to learn, say, the piano, for example, or play a musical instrument, you have to realize that it's going to take a long time to master techniques of playing a cello or playing a violin or playing a piano. It may take 3 or 4 years before I've spent a lot of time watching young musicians, and I was watching a week ago some young, they were all Chinese. This was in Sydney at a private music school, and several of the students were asked to do a little concert. And I was watching this girl playing a cello. I don't know whether you've seen a cello. It's a long kind of neck, if you like. There's no indication of where you put a finger. So to get the correct note, the same as you play a trombone, you push it in and out to get the right note. There's no indication of how far out it goes. The same with a violin or a cello. You have to, when they start playing the cello, they put little markings on it, so you know that's where you put the finger. But then those taken away, you have to know exactly where to put that finger to get that. Now, some children give up after 6 months. They don't see it's worth it. It's so difficult. So there's a quite high dropout when children are learning to play the piano or other musical instruments. They have to realize that if you really want to get here, you've got to persist. You've got to have a goal. And the same the same with language learning. You have to see what is the capital, what is the value of learning. For some, it might be the chance to travel overseas. Some, it might be to make international friends. For some, it might be just to get a job. It's a requirement of an entry-level position in a job. So this notion of the potential value influences the motivation that they have and the persistence that they will have in working on learning a new language. So I think it was Dornier who talked about the idea of an imagined view of yourself, aspirational view of yourself, the sort of person you would like to be, and they see proficiency in a language as part of that imagined view of themselves. Maybe they model themselves on other family members or friends or people they see on television or whatever, and they see that as the person I would like to be. I would like to be like that. And this notion of motivation there. So he, David Dornier argued that mastery of English could be a core component of this possible, what you call future self, which is a powerful motivational tool. Classroom activities themselves can also be motivating or demotivating, and there's a when you're designing materials, such as I've done many times as a textbook writer, and you have done as teachers, you try to choose activities that will be motivating, that are purposeful, that are not overloaded with content, that promote learning involvement and engagement, and give learners a sense of success rather than failure. And this is sometimes referred to as the Goldilocks rule for assessing the success of a learning activity, which argues, I don't know whether you know the story of Goldilocks, who goes into the forest and she enters the home of three bears and takes three different bowls of porridge at three different temperatures. So sits in three different chairs at three different heights, and she lies on three different beds at three different levels of comfort. And then she chooses the porridge, the chair, and the bed, and they're just right for her. So I've seen this referred to in education that peak motivation, just as in the Goldilocks story, occurs at a level where the learner is right on the edge of their current abilities. The task should not be too easy and it should not be too hard. It should be just right with a manageable level of difficulty so the learner can progress to the next stage. And so that is the Goldilocks rule. The task has to stretch them, but not too much, to encourage them to move ahead to the next level, if you like. I talked about self-efficacy in relation to teachers, but it's also a factor that is important when we talk about how learners view their own effectiveness as language learners, their ability to succeed in learning English, to achieve their goals. One of the things I've been interested in the last few years is, when I come to countries like Thailand or go to conferences, or one thing I do every year is I take young students, pianists, to master classes in Europe and Switzerland. And these master classes are multilingual groups, so there might be 30 people from all over the world. I take young people from New Zealand and Australia. There they meet many other young people from different parts of the world. The language, the common language they have is English. And when I meet these young people, I often ask them, how did you get your English as good as it is? They never say, oh, from textbooks at school. They basically describe things that they did outside of the class, as you have all done. So I would sit down, oh, I watch television, or I watch movies and so on. So they extend their opportunities to learn through things they do beyond the classroom. Now, here is a couple of examples. Just this young man, whenever I saw a tourist, I would try not to not shy. Just talking straight to mostly I listen to chat with people. The other student there, I learn more in communicating with foreigners. I often approach foreigners and to speak with them. This Chilean student, who's a pianist, talked about using Instagram to learn through interaction with other learners. I created an Instagram account, which I only followed profiles just contact with them in German and many other topics. In this way, the time I spent every day scrolling through social media became a way of learning German. This guy, by the way, he spoke extremely good English and French, which he had taught himself, and now he's learning German. Now, this is somebody with a very high level of self-efficacy, because he insists and he sets goals, and he's never given up. And he argued that when he was in high school in Chile, he didn't find the school curriculum and the schooling course at all useful, because, of course, most of those school-based courses are geared towards passing an entrance exam for university, and they're reading and grammar-based as a rule. They don't really focus on general communication skills. So, like many of the young people that I've interviewed, they are looking for opportunities to take care of their own learning, as he mentions there. So self-efficacy helps learners persist, if you like, through the difficulties if they feel that what they're doing is effective. Is the notion of self-efficacy, what they're doing is effective. If they felt it wasn't effective, they wouldn't do it, of course. Again, agency, I talked about earlier, the extent to which learners can actively contribute to and manage change in their own learning, to act independently, to make choices about their learning. During COVID, I'm from New Zealand originally. During COVID, and lots of young Europeans go to New Zealand and they work in restaurants and various situations part-time. We had a German boy staying with with my sister. My sister and I had a big property in New Zealand and put a lot of maintenance with our. We used to give accommodation to these international students. They do 4 hours work a day and they get free room and board. Anyway, during COVID, there were 15,000 German students stranded in New Zealand, and the German government had to take hire special planes to get them out. The boy that was staying with my sister, who was 16, straight out of high school in Germany, flawless English. And again, I would, how did you get English like that? Oh, they regard it as a sort of dumb question. It's self-evident, oh, well, television, songs, all that kind of thing. But the thing is, these kids take charge of their own learning, many of these young people I speak to. And one of the main opportunities, of course, is television and movies and songs. But there's a difference between countries like the northern countries, Finland, Denmark, Scandinavia, and the southern countries like Portugal and Spain. In those northern countries, they do not dub. The television and movies are shown in the original language with subtitles. So they're hearing, if they start watching songs or listening to songs and gradually watching stuff in English or whatever the language is they're just learning, there's no dubbing. Whereas in Portugal and Spain, there's extensive amount of dubbing. So kids go through school, secondary school, and they're not being exposed to a lot of English. And so you find that in Portugal and Spain, it's much less likely to be able to stop a kid on the street and say, excuse me, I'm trying to find the best place to buy blah, blah, blah. The average kid you stop on the street in Denmark, Scandinavia, Finland, they're just breaking through perfectly acceptable English. And they don't regard it as special. That's just normal. And so they take charge of their own learning. First of all, motivation. They realize that they need English because it's the second language of that. It's a global language and blah, blah, blah. They look for things that work for them. One or two of the students I spoke to talked about watching TV series in English. In fact, I remember in Iran one time I was traveling there and the sponsors of my visit had assigned 2 teachers to travel with me. They both English teachers, spoke excellent English. And you think of Iran as a country where there's not much interest in learning English because of what you read in the newspaper about the mullahs and all that kind of. In fact, there's a huge demand for English as a way, in the sense of resisting government policy. Every little town you go to in Iran, you have language schools. Most of them use illegal copies of my books. And I remember one of these teachers saying to me, referring to a particular television program, which was about apparently 2 New Zealand singers who travel around the United States, and they're kind of amusing because there's strong Kiwi accents. It's called The Flight of the Conchords. I've never seen it, but this boy was telling me, in episode 3, Bill goes into this barn, he could almost recite exchanges and so on. And there's a kind of a lot of research on the Friends TV series that looks at the impact of watching television. So I'm just rambling here, but I'm really coming back to this notion of agency, taking charge of your own learning. And here's that same student again from Chile talking about TV and movies. A conversation, correct manner. So they notice these things. They notice how people speak. They notice the expressions they use. And he's talking about the difference between that experience and the school experience, which he found totally unmotivating. So just to pull together some of the points I'm trying to make here, is that the person you see in the tennis club is a different person from the person you see when they become a teacher in the classroom. So the teacher self now takes over. And similarly, the student you see enjoying a movie with friends at the cinema becomes a different person when they step into the classroom. You could say that their learner self now takes over. Now, when we're training teachers, we often ask them to go and observe other teachers or to look at videos of other teachers, and they're often given sort of protocol, a checklist to use. and they might check off various things, the amount of teacher talk, number of questions that were asked, and so on. These observation forms really focus on low inference categories of behavior, things that can be observed and quantified. But the things that I've been talking about are high inference as things that you infer. They're not directly observable, so you can only identify them through conversation, through narratives, through talking to teachers, and so on. So I referred earlier to the terms, some may be open, some secret, some blind, and some may be undiscovered. So you cannot get these things from a simple observation of one teacher's classes and observing learners on one occasion. These are much more complex, subtle features of the classroom dynamics that go on in every classroom, shaped by the notion of teacher self and the learner self that I've tried to share with you today. The slides, by the way, which has got the some of the references I've drawn from here, and also those are the ones that I've read. So further reading here, and also some of the references I cited there. So thank you for your interest, and I look forward to any thoughts or comments you may like to use. Or observations or examples from your own experiences as learners or as teachers. This is the silence. Willingness.
Hybrid, right?
Willingness to communicate.
The chat box. Yeah, participants at home, right?
Yeah, there we go. No, that's the perfect.
Okay.
Oh, there's a huge long comment there.
Yes.
I am my industry that is using I still sitting at which everyone else prioritizes. I would advise you to read Gary Versertman, who's at the University of Auckland, if you're doing this narrative inquiry. He's written a great deal about narrative inquiry and a book about how to do narrative inquiry. So the person you should be looking at is not me, but Gary Versertman. I think he's at the University of Auckland. He's a South African linguist. I'm trying to remember how his first name. Yes. He's just going to try to check his name for you because he's the expert on narrative inquiry, and I read his work when I want to know more about it. I just give him the reference for you the Dutch name. Let's see if there's another. Is there another comment? Oh, there it is. It's not there. He's got it there. But actually, that's the one I'm talking about. Yeah. Sorry. Is that how you spell it?
Yeah, this one, right?
That's the one. Yes, you already. So you already know that man's work. He is the one that I would ask you to look at more closely rather than give me my opinion on. He's a specialist in that. Yeah. Is there another comment there? Because again, you said which one is the most important exploring language? I think you have to use multiple sources of information, observation, interviews, narratives. They all have strengths and narratives are kind of easier to get. Interviews take time. Journals, I've heard Tom Farrell and I written a lot about use of teacher journals. So I would simply say that several would be needed. Any other comments there or questions coming up? You can see the messages. Else comes to it. You've exhausted the questions and the questions that you
Yes, thank you. So that this is at home.
Good morning again, Professor Richard. I am kind of a big fan of you. And actually, all of us, we like you a lot in our work. And it's very grateful to see you here. So currently, I'm studying about learner autonomy. And I found that it is quite a broad idea. But we know that the aim of the classroom is we want to foster autonomy for our students. So I really want to know from you, how can we, language teachers, foster autonomy in the classroom?
I think that one thing you can do is to find out what your learners do, what they find effective, and your source of data will definitely be your learners. So you want to, in any class, there'll be students at different levels of proficiency, some are ahead of others. What are they doing that makes them more successful than others? So I would say that the classroom is a resource, and I would want to find out what do they do, how do they start, those ones who are doing very well and making progress. What do they do in the beginning? What do they do now? What do they find useful now? And so on. Some it might be internet, some it might be, I was traveling in France not long ago, and behind me, I could hear a parent and a child. I couldn't turn around and have a look at them, but they were obviously playing the father was teaching some sort of video game, which was all in English. They were both French, but I could hear the little boy say, and the father was explaining in English the rules of the game. Now, this is a perfect example of a kid wanting to play a video game, and the English, you need to learn enough English to know the rules of the game. So again, I was fascinated just listening to that going on. This is a perfect example of a kid who must have been very young. I didn't like to look around and see who he was, but he must have been very young. So in your class, you will find all sorts of personal strategies that work for some students, maybe not so well for others. That Chilean boy that I mentioned told me that when he started learning French, he would go around and put the French words on all the things in the house, like television, and he put the names of these things. He'd stick them on with Post-it notes. I don't know whether anyone else has ever done that, but that worked for him initially. He wanted to get a vocabulary going as quickly as possible. Then he joined the Instagram group. So it's hard to predict, but certainly what is a fact, I guarantee you, is that students who are doing best have got strategies that they've worked out. And so the good thing is and that's why I love talking to these young people. I did a paper here last year, which is going to appear somewhere. What was it called? The Future of the Past, really looking at how strategies that students today are so different from the way they were taught in the class, and how most of what actually is successful is out of class, not in class. And so the classroom has to be a bridge to these things that they do out of class. So that's what I would do, just to find out through a questionnaire, for example. It could be a normal classroom activity questionnaire. What movies do you? What songs do you? For example, they talk about songs. What songs? ChatGPT would be good like that too, because if you ask ChatGPT, what are some good songs that are easy to sing and good for learning certain expressions of English, and I'll come up with something like that. But some people might find songs interesting, some may not. So it's a very personal thing, isn't it? But there's a core of common strategies, I think, that certainly watching movies in the original language. Again, what kind of movies? Some movies are very hard. I often have to have the subtitles in myself because the English is too obscure for me even. So what sort of movies did they find? And they talk about the TV series Friends, because those are short. They are young people chatting and they are talking about daily life and so on. And that whole language institutes have been built around that Friends TV series. So I don't know whether your students watch that or there may be others say, oh, this K-pop phenomenon, you know, there's so many things going on that young people are in a different universe and they often need English to enter that universe. So the question is what resources do they make use of?
Thank you very much. And the other thing I really want to share, and I want some insight from you as well, is that
Because the participant at home.
Alright. So my preliminary study was done with students who are the English major education. And I got a question from one of my professors that why you choose this group of students because they already are good in English. So this means that they might already have a very high motivation or good learner autonomy in themselves already. So I just would like to confirm my determination to still choosing them as my participants. That why we should look at this group of the English major students fostering learner autonomy there.
Right. Well, I'm reminded of a very famous paper by Joan Rubin years ago called The Good Language Learner. So again, you are looking at here the successful language user as your, and so you've chosen these, they're all examples of successful users of English, successful multilingual speakers of English. So I think that's, you know, a very useful way of choosing your sample. Of course, you could also choose a very different kind of sample, students who have not been successful, and what is it that they have not found useful for them? What made them give up, or what gave them not to choose opportunities that other students make use of? Yeah, that's a topic that I'm very interested in as well, because as I say, when I travel a lot, I'm always interested in the people I meet. How did you get where you are? I could ask you the same question. So maybe I will ask you the same question. What are some of the things that you did to achieve your mastery?
I don't know. Actually, just do something. Yeah, just as you say, outside of that.
For example,
I watch TED Talk.
you watch TED Talks, okay?
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Maybe listen to music.
Music, okay. There's quite a literature on TED Talks. Because I think David Brennan and I edited a book on Learning Beyond the Classroom, and there's a chapter there on using TED Talks. Able conversation, but again, everybody's got answers as to how they got where they are. And of course, much of the industry on English language teaching has tended to focus on the classroom. The idea being we've got to make the classroom like a mini version of the real world. And so things like task-based language teaching try to create authentic opportunities for interaction and so on. But in fact, even if we succeed in that, the amount of classroom time is very limited. And there's much more time needed. So you cannot just rely on the classroom, no matter how good it is and how good my books are. We cannot rely on that to guarantee success. They have to be a bridge to things that they do on their own. And using WhatsApp and sometimes now all the technology and so on is making it so much more possible to make the classroom more like the real world, to bring into the classroom sort of resources that students use at home, you know, email and social media, and WhatsApp, and all that sort of thing, YouTube and so on. Yeah, so changing the world, and yet thousands of people, you know, succeed in mastering English and other languages. It'd be interesting in Thailand to find out we do the same issue with Thai people in Thai, for example. You know, AUA used to have two Thai courses. One was traditional Thai language course. The other was a sort of based on Passion's silent method. In other words, there was no production initially, just input. So they ran two Thai language courses. I think they still do. But at the time when they announced this and started talking about it, it struck me as rather hard because if you're learning Thai, you need Thai to get onto the taxi driver. You can't just be listening. You need production very early on. They often say we should delay production and start just with input. But when you're in an immersion situation like Thailand, surrounded by a lot of time, you need production very early on. And a lot of it will just be fixed expressions, memorize routines for handling simple transactions before you move to more real, authentic use of original uses of language. So I don't know whether that has been researched, whatever became of those two approaches to teaching Thai and how successful were they? But again, you could do the same. You find in countries like Thailand and Korea, on television, they often use a foreigner as a presenter who speaks excellent Thai or excellent Korean. And it's interesting to see these people. We always think it's a miracle if you hear somebody's foreigner speaking Thai. We don't think it is a miracle when there's about 100,000 people who speak English, 100,000 Thais who speak English fluently. We think it's a miracle when we hear a foreigner speaking Thai well. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? And then they put them on television. Oh, it's so incredible. It's a Thai, and English Americans can speak Thai. It's incredible. But fully you can watch your TV. So he's a Thai who speaks English. I'm amazing. Anyway, thank you. Anything else? I'll give some in my paper.
Yes, after I will work with it.
Sure.
Sure.
Okay, send it to you. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Please participants join us today. The next 4. Yes, it's on October 10th. It's about AI from 2 professors, Professor Curtis Lawton, University, and Professor Vanessa from Florida State University. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Next time.
Yeah.